Welcome. Tonight's story is about the Elamites, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, a kingdom that flourished for 3,000 years in the land that would eventually become Iran, a people who built magnificent cities and wrote in a script that scholars still cannot fully read, who produced art of extraordinary beauty, and queens who ruled with absolute power in a world where women were rarely permitted to rule at all. A civilization that shaped the Persian Empire that came after it, and that the world has almost entirely forgotten. Take a deep breath. Let your body settle. Let the sounds of the present fade. Tonight we travel to the ancient plain of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran, to a land where the rivers Karun and Karkeh flow down from the Zagros mountains toward the lowland plain, where the soil is rich and the summers are brutal and the winters mild, where human beings have been building cities for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. This is a slow journey, a quiet one, the kind of story that rewards patience, that gives back more the more carefully you listen. And if these stories bring you peace and help you rest, we would love for you to subscribe and turn on notifications so every new story finds its way to you. Leave us a comment below. Tell us which civilization you want us to explore next. Your voice shapes what we create. Now, breathe and let the ancient plain carry you. In the year 1187 BCE, more than 3,000 years ago, an army marched out of the mountains and descended onto the plain of Mesopotamia. They were not the largest army the ancient world had ever seen. They were not the most technologically advanced. They did not have iron weapons at a time when iron was still rare and precious, or chariots more sophisticated than their enemies, or tactical innovations that their opponents had never encountered. What they had was audacity, and a king named Shutruk nahhunte, who understood that the greatest city in the world was distracted by its own internal politics, that its walls were formidable but not impregnable to a determined force, and that inside those walls sat an object so sacred, so central to the entire religious and political identity of Mesopotamian civilization, that taking it would be the most devastating act of conquest imaginable. The object was the statue of Marduk, the supreme god of Babylon, the divine king of the Mesopotamian pantheon, the figure whose continued presence in his temple was understood to be the literal, physical guarantee of Babylon's prosperity, its security, and its place at the center of the cosmic order. No army had ever taken Marduk. Shutruk nahhunte's army took Marduk. They carried the statue out of the great temple of Esagila, the most sacred building in Babylonia, loaded it onto their wagons along with dozens of other trophy objects, including the famous Stele of Hammurabi, the black stone pillar inscribed with the world's most celebrated early law code, and marched it back across the plain up into the mountains to their capital city, to Susa, the city that would become, within 2 centuries of this moment, the capital of the Persian Empire. The city that had been occupied for more than 5,000 years before Shutruk nahhunte ever walked its streets. The city that was, at the moment of this greatest triumph, the capital of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world, the capital of Elam. You have probably not heard of Elam. This is remarkable because Elam was not a minor civilization. It was not a small regional power that flickered briefly and left nothing behind. It was a civilization of 3,000 years continuous existence, beginning approximately in the 4th millennium BCE and persisting through transformations and conquests and revivals until the 7th century BCE, when the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal finally, definitively, and with extraordinary brutality, ended it. 3,000 years. For context, The Roman Empire lasted approximately 500 years from its founding to its final fall. The entire history of the United States is less than 300 years. The period of time between us and the fall of Rome is roughly 1,500 years. Elam lasted twice as long as the entire span between us and the fall of Rome, and almost nobody has heard of it. Why? Partly because Elam left its records in languages and scripts that took a very long time to decipher, and one of which, the proto-Elamite script, has still not been fully deciphered. Partly because the civilizations that surrounded Elam, Mesopotamia, Persia, Assyria, were better documented and more studied by the scholars who first reconstructed the ancient world. Partly because the physical remains of the great Elamite cities were buried under millennia of subsequent occupation and only partially excavated. And partly simply because Elam lost. It was destroyed in the end so thoroughly that for centuries the world did not know it had existed, and civilizations that are destroyed tend to lose control of their own stories, to be remembered only in the records of their enemies, in the triumphant accounts of those who conquered them. But Elam existed. It built magnificent things. It produced people of extraordinary intelligence and ambition. And its story, the story of 3,000 years of civilization in the ancient Iranian highlands and lowlands, is one of the most extraordinary in the history of the ancient world. This is the story of Elam, the forgotten empire, the civilization that preceded Persia, and the people who stole the god of Babylon. To understand Elam, you must understand its geography, because Elam's geography was not simple, and its complexity shaped everything about the civilization that developed within it. The territory of Elam, at its greatest extent, encompassed two very different kinds of landscape. The first was the lowland plain of what is now Khuzestan province in southwestern Iran. This is the land where the great rivers come down from the mountains, the Karun, the Karke, the Dez, and spread across a flat, well-watered plain before eventually joining the river systems of Mesopotamia and emptying into the Persian Gulf. The plain is hot, extraordinarily hot in summer, with temperatures that regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius in the modern era, and were probably not significantly cooler in antiquity. But it is also fertile. The rivers bring silt and water, and the agricultural potential of the well-irrigated lowland is extraordinary. The most important city of this lowland region was Susa, a city whose occupation begins in the 5th millennium BCE, which makes it one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, and which served as the primary capital of Elam for most of its history. The second landscape was the highland region of what is now Khuzestan's eastern margins and the Zagros mountain valleys, a very different world from the lowland plain. Cooler, more rugged, cut by deep river valleys and defined by the dramatic profiles of mountain ranges that rise thousands of meters above the plain. The highland cities of Elam, particularly Anshan, located in what is now the Fars province of Iran, occupied fertile intermontane valleys that provided agricultural land, timber, and access to the mineral resources of the mountains. The relationship between these two regions, lowland and highland, hot plain and cool mountains, was the defining dynamic of Elamite civilization. At times, the lowland capital of Susa dominated the political life of Elam, with the highland region as a subordinate partner. At other times, the highland center of Anshan held primacy, with Susa as the lowland extension of highland power. The tension and the complementarity between these two regions, their different resources, their different climatic rhythms, their different relationships with neighboring civilizations, gave Elamite history much of its characteristic dynamism. The Elamite kings called themselves, in their official titulature, King of Anshan and Susa, a formula that acknowledged both regions simultaneously, that refused to privilege one over the other, that expressed the dual nature of the kingdom in its very self-description. The neighbors of Elam shaped it as profoundly as the land itself. To the west lay Mesopotamia, the great river civilization of the Tigris and Euphrates, where the Sumerians and Akkadians and Babylonians and Assyrians built the cities and institutions and literary traditions that would define the ancient Near East for millennia. Elam's relationship with Mesopotamia was the central dynamic of its external history. Sometimes alliance, sometimes conflict, sometimes conquest in both directions, always exchange of goods and ideas and people. To the north lay the various peoples of the Iranian plateau and the Zagros mountains, peoples whom the ancient sources describe vaguely as highland barbarians, but who were in reality complex communities with their own traditions and their own resources, particularly the metals of the mountains. To the east lay the civilizations of the Iranian plateau, and beyond them the Indus Valley, trading partners and cultural influences whose presence in the Elamite record is less prominent than Mesopotamia, but real and significant. Elam was not isolated, it was connected to every major civilization of the ancient world within reach of the Persian Gulf and the overland routes of the ancient Near East. Its geographic position made it, inevitably, a node in the commercial and cultural networks of the ancient world, and its civilization reflected that connectivity, absorbing influences from Mesopotamia, from the plateau cultures to the east and north, from the maritime traders of the Gulf, while developing something distinctly its own. Something that took 3,000 years to fully express itself. The story of Elam does not begin with kings and temples and grand armies. It begins with clay, specifically with thousands of small clay tablets found at archaeological sites across the ancient Iranian plateau and lowlands, inscribed with a system of marks that represents one of the earliest writing systems in human history, and one of the most puzzling. The writing system, known to scholars as Proto-Elamite, was developed sometime around 3200 to 3000 BCE, approximately the same time that cuneiform writing was being developed in Mesopotamia and hieroglyphic writing was emerging in Egypt. This near simultaneity is itself remarkable, and the relationship between these early writing systems, whether they influenced each other or developed independently in response to similar social and economic pressures, is still a matter of scholarly debate. What is not debated is the existence and the remarkable distribution of Proto-Elamite. More than 5,000 Proto-Elamite tablets have been found at sites scattered across a vast geographic area, from Susa in the southwest to Tepe Yahya in southeastern Iran, from sites in the Zagros Mountains to sites on the central Iranian plateau. This distribution suggests that Proto-Elamite was not the writing system of a single city, but of a genuine interregional network, a system of record-keeping used by trading communities across a large area of what is now Iran. The tablets record transactions, accounts, inventories, the boring but essential data of commercial civilization. How many sheep were received, how much grain was dispensed, what quantities of which goods moved between which locations. This is the writing of merchants and administrators, of people who needed to track things precisely, who understood that memory was insufficient for the complexity of the commercial relationships they were managing, who developed the technology of writing not for literature or religion or royal propaganda, but for the practical purpose of knowing where things were and where they had gone. Here is the frustrating truth about Proto-Elamite. After more than a century of scholarly effort, using every available tool of linguistics and pattern analysis and computational approaches, the script has not been deciphered. Not partially, not tentatively, not in the sense that we can read some tablets with confidence, even if others remain obscure. The Proto-Elamite script remains, as of the current state of scholarship, unreadable in the sense that we cannot recover the specific words and language that it represents. We know it was a recording system. We can identify some of the numeric signs and understand something of the accounting conventions used. We can see that certain signs appear together consistently and that the tablets are organized in particular ways. But the underlying language, what Proto-Elamite sounded like, what grammatical structure it had, what vocabulary it employed, is inaccessible to us. This is particularly frustrating because Proto-Elamite is the most widespread early writing system in the ancient world in terms of geographic distribution. More sites have yielded Proto-Elamite tablets than sites have yielded early Mesopotamian cuneiform. The network that used this script was, by the evidence, larger and more extensive than the contemporary Mesopotamian urban network, and we cannot read it. The earliest Elamites were writing things down, systematically and extensively, in a writing system that has defeated every scholarly attempt at decipherment for more than a century. What were they saying? We do not know. The silence of Proto-Elamite is one of the deepest silences in the ancient world. Of all the cities that Elamite civilization produced, none is more remarkable than Susa. Not because it was the most dramatic. Susa's architecture was not as monumental as the ziggurats of Mesopotamia or the pyramids of Egypt, at least not in the remains that have survived. Not because its position was the most commanding. The lowland plain of Khuzestan is not a landscape of natural drama, but because of its longevity. Susa was occupied more or less continuously from approximately 4200 BCE until the medieval Islamic period, a span of more than 5,000 years of human habitation. This makes it one of the longest continuously occupied urban sites in the history of the world. 5,000 years. In that span of time, Susa was a Neolithic village, a proto-urban center, the capital of the Elamite kingdom, a provincial capital of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, where Darius and Xerxes built some of their greatest palaces, a Hellenistic city under the successors of Alexander the Great, a Parthian and Sassanid city, and an Islamic city. It changed hands, changed names, changed languages, changed religions. It never stopped being inhabited. The archaeological tale of Susa, the mound of accumulated human occupation that rises above the plain, is one of the deepest and most complex archaeological deposits in the Near East. The layers of human activity compressed into this mound represent the full sweep of ancient Near Eastern history, from the Chalcolithic period through to the Islamic era. The first systematic excavations at Susa were conducted by French archaeologists beginning in 1884, excavations that have continued with interruptions for more than a century and that have produced a record of extraordinary richness and complexity. The finds from Susa are housed primarily in the Louvre Museum in Paris, a circumstance that reflects the colonial politics of 19th and early 20th century archaeology, and that remains a source of tension between France and Iran. The Iranian National Museum in Tehran houses significant Elamite materials as well, and Iranian archaeologists have conducted important excavations at Susa and related sites in recent decades. The Susa of the early Elamite period, the Susa that was developing into a major center in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, was a city of remarkable material culture. The painted pottery of early Susa is among the most beautiful ceramic art of the ancient world. The vessels are painted in geometric designs of extraordinary precision, animals stylized to near abstraction, geometric patterns of repeating elements, compositions that use the curved surface of the vessel as an integral part of the design in ways that reflect sophisticated spatial thinking. These are not the pots of people who were learning to make pottery. They are the products of a mature craft tradition with its own aesthetic conventions and its own standards of excellence. A tradition that had been developing for centuries and that had arrived at forms of beauty that remain striking even now, 5,000 years later. The stamp seals of early Susa, small carved stone objects used to mark ownership and authenticate transactions, show similar sophistication. Animals, divine figures, geometric designs carved in miniature with precise detail, pressed into clay to leave their marks on the commercial and administrative documents of the city, and the cylinder seals, the rolling seal form developed in Mesopotamia and adopted by Elam, show the full range of Elamite religious and mythological imagery, the specific divine figures and sacred animals and ritual scenes that defined the Elamite spiritual world. We can see what the early Elamites made. We can see, in some sense, what they found beautiful. What we cannot yet hear, or what the undeciphered script withholds from us, is what they said about what they made and what they believed and what they hoped for. Sometime in the late 3rd millennium BCE, approximately 2700 to 2500 BCE, the political landscape of the ancient Near East shifted in ways that brought Elam into the clear light of written history. Not through Elamite records. The Elamite writing tradition of this period is still only partially legible. Through Mesopotamian records, the cuneiform texts of the Sumerian and Akkadian cities that encountered Elam as a neighbor, a trading partner, and sometimes an enemy. These Mesopotamian references to Elam are among the earliest clear historical evidence we have for the Elamite kingdom. They describe Elam as a powerful entity to the east, a kingdom with its own king, its own cities, its own military capacity. They describe military conflicts between Mesopotamian cities and Elam, and commercial relationships that brought Elamite goods, copper from the mountains, lapis lazuli from the east, tin from highland sources, into the markets of Sumer. The most significant early Elamite text is the Treaty of Naram-Sin, a tablet recording an agreement between the Akkadian king Naram-Sin, who ruled approximately 2254 to 2218 BCE, and an Elamite king. This is one of the earliest known diplomatic treaties in human history. Two ancient states recognizing each other as peers, formalizing their relationship in writing. The Elamite kingdom was by this period a state capable of making treaties with the most powerful empire in the ancient world. The old Elamite period, roughly the late 3rd and early 2nd millennium BCE, is characterized by the gradual development of distinctly Elamite political and cultural institutions. The most distinctive of these was the Sukalma system, a specific form of governance unique to Elam, in which political authority was distributed among a hierarchy of royal officials. The Sukalma, the supreme ruler, the Sukal of Elam and Shimashki, a secondary ruler, often a brother or nephew of the Sukalma, and the Sukal of Susa, a third tier, often a son of the Sukal of Elam. This system, in which authority was shared among related men in a specific hierarchical arrangement, with succession passing laterally from brother to brother before passing to the next generation, was unusual in the ancient Near East, where most monarchies passed directly from father to son. The Sukalma system reflected something about Elamite political culture, a tendency toward the distribution of power among members of the ruling family rather than its concentration in a single absolute monarch. Whether this was a practical adaptation to the geographic complexity of the kingdom, the need to have effective authority in both the highland and lowland regions simultaneously, or a cultural preference for a particular form of governance, is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the Sukalma system worked. It sustained Elamite political organization for several centuries, through periods of both prosperity and adversity. The women of the Elamite royal family had a remarkable role in this system. The queen mothers, the mothers of the Sukalma, held specific titles and specific powers that went beyond the ceremonial roles typically assigned to royal women in the ancient Near East. The Elamite texts use the title Mother of the King with a reverence and a political weight that suggests this was not merely an honorific. The Queen Mother of Elam appears to have had real authority over religious ceremonies, over the education and advancement of the next generation of rulers, over the domestic and administrative life of the palace. In a world where women were almost universally excluded from formal political power, the Elamite tradition gave the mothers of kings a specific, recognized, formalized role that the evidence suggests was genuinely influential. This is one of the many ways in which Elam was different from its neighbors. The Middle Elamite period, roughly 1500 to 1100 BC, was the height of Elamite power and the era of the civilization's greatest achievements. It was the period of the great kings, of military campaigns that reached deep into Mesopotamia, of building projects that transformed Susa and the other Elamite cities into some of the most impressive urban centers of the ancient Near East. And it was the period of shutruk, nahhunte, and the theft of marduk. But before we arrive at that dramatic moment, we need to understand what Elam had become by the 12th century BCE, what the civilization had achieved in the 4 centuries leading up to its greatest triumph. The Middle Elamite period began with a political transformation, the emergence of a new dynasty, the Iggihalkid dynasty, that consolidated Elamite power and initiated a period of ambitious building and expansion. The most important of the Iggihalkid kings was Untashnapirisha, who ruled in the 14th century BCE and who undertook the most remarkable building project in Elamite history. He built a new capital city, not an expansion of Susa, not a renovation of existing urban centers, a completely new city built from scratch in the middle of the plain between Susa and the highlands, a city called Dur-Untash, the fortress of Untash, known today as Chogha Zanbil. And at the center of this new city, he built something that has survived, partially, imperfectly, but recognizably, to the present day. He built a ziggurat. The ziggurat of Chogha Zanbil is the best preserved ancient ziggurat in the world. The Mesopotamian ziggurats, the great stepped towers of Ur and Babylon and Nippur, are known primarily from ancient descriptions and from the ruined stubs of their lower levels. The famous ziggurat of Ur, built by Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, survives to a height of about 30 meters out of an original estimated height of perhaps 50 meters. The Tower of Babel, the great ziggurat of Babylon, is known from ancient texts and from the shallow depressions it left in the earth, but virtually nothing of the structure itself survives. Chogha Zanbil is different. The ziggurat of Chogha Zanbil survives to a height of approximately 25 meters, preserving 2 of its original 5 stories in recognizable form. The base of the structure is approximately 105 meters on each side. The total volume of brick contained in the structure is enormous. Millions of individually hand-formed and kiln-fired mud bricks, each stamped with the name of the king who built them. Walking around the base of Chogha Zanbil today, the site is in a remote area of Khuzestan province, not often visited. And looking up at the surviving walls of the ancient tower, the experience is one of genuine awe. The brickwork is still tight and precise. The inscribed bricks are still legible. The name of Untashnapirisha, pressed into the clay 3,400 years ago, still readable. The ziggurat was dedicated to the great Elamite gods, primarily in Shushinak, the lord of Susa, and Napirisha, the great god of Elam, and was the center of a sacred complex that included temples, royal palaces, administrative buildings, and the infrastructure of a functioning capital city. The construction of Chogha Zanbil was an act of royal ambition comparable to the great building projects of any ancient civilization. Untashnapirisha was declaring in brick and bitumen and the sweat of thousands of laborers that Elam was a kingdom worthy to stand alongside Egypt and Babylon in the hierarchy of civilized states. He was right. But the city he built was never fully completed. Untashnapirisha died before the project was finished, and his successors did not continue it. The city was partially occupied for a period, but eventually abandoned without ever functioning as the royal capital that its builder intended. The ziggurat stands alone on the plain, the centerpiece of a city that was only half built, the monument of a dream that outlasted its dreamer. The religious world of the Elamites is known to us imperfectly. Through the inscriptions that survive, through the artistic evidence of the seals and the relief sculptures, through the architectural evidence of the temples and the sacred objects found within them. But what we know is enough to outline a religious tradition of considerable sophistication, one that developed its own distinctive character while absorbing influences from the Mesopotamian religious world. The supreme god of the Elamite pantheon was Inshushinak, the lord of Susa, the divine ruler of the city that served as Elam's capital for most of its history. Inshushinak was a god of the underworld and of justice, a divine judge who weighed the souls of the dead and determined their fate. He was depicted as a bull or as a human figure with bull attributes, the strength and power of the great animal serving as the visual language for divine authority. The most sacred place of Inshushinak's worship was the temple of Inshushinak at Susa, the temple that served as the city's primary religious center, that received the greatest offerings and the most careful maintenance. That was the destination of the great religious processions that marked the Elamite religious calendar. Napirisha, the great god, was another major figure in the Elamite pantheon, associated with the highland regions and with the specific divine power of the mountains. The name Napirisha appears in the royal titulature of multiple Elamite kings, incorporated into their personal names as a marker of divine favor and divine connection. Pinikir was the great goddess, a divine female figure who appears in multiple aspects across the Elamite tradition. She is depicted on seals and in relief sculptures as a seated figure, sometimes flanked by smaller divine beings holding symbols of power and blessing. She was the patron of certain royal women, and her worship appears to have been particularly associated with the female members of the Elamite royal family. The religious life of ordinary Elamites, the prayers they said at home shrines, the specific rituals they performed for the specific occasions of their lives, is less well documented than the official royal religion. But the material evidence from Susa and other sites includes large numbers of small figurines, votive offerings, and ritual objects that were clearly used in domestic religious practice, suggesting a lived religious tradition that extended far beyond the great state temples. One of the most distinctive features of Elamite religion was its treatment of sacred animals. The lion, the bull, the eagle, the serpent, these creatures appear throughout Elamite art in ways that suggest they were not simply decorative motifs, but carriers of specific divine meaning. The great bronze statue of a seated lion found at Susa, now in the Louvre, is one of the most powerful ancient sculptures in existence, its eyes inlaid with precious material, its body conveying a sense of contained power that the ancient sculptor achieved through a complete mastery of the medium. This statue was not merely decorative, it was placed in a specific sacred context, at the entrance to a temple or a palace, as a guardian, as a manifestation of divine protection, as the physical presence of a power that would repel those who approached with harmful intent. The serpent had particular significance in Elamite religious imagination, appearing on seals, in reliefs, on pottery, as a figure of both danger and divine power. The great bronze serpents found at Elamite sites, coiling in their specific decorative style, speak of a religious tradition in which the serpent occupied a central symbolic role that scholars have not yet fully explained. The Elamites worshipped in ways we can partially reconstruct, but not fully understand. Their gods had names, their temples had specific architectural forms, their religious calendar had specific festivals, their priests and priestesses performed specific rituals. But the specific content of those rituals, prayers, the hymns, the myths, survives only in fragments, and much of it remains inaccessible. The religion of Elam is like the civilization itself, present in its remains but speaking a language we have not yet fully learned to understand. In the ancient Near East, women were rarely permitted to hold formal political power. The queens of Mesopotamia were prestigious figures, honored, wealthy, attended by large household staffs. But their power was derivative, dependent on their relationship to a husband or son who held the real authority. The occasional woman who held formal political power in Mesopotamia, the legendary Kubaba of Kish, the various Entu priestesses who wielded significant religious authority, was the exception to a well-established rule. Elam was different, not completely different. The Elamite world was not a matriarchy. Men held the great royal titles. Men led the armies. Men built the monuments that bear their names. But Elamite women, particularly the women of the royal family, had a recognized, formal, documented authority that went beyond what their Mesopotamian contemporaries possessed. The most striking evidence for this comes from the Elamite administrative texts, the clay tablets that record the bureaucratic life of the Elamite kingdom. These texts from various periods show women receiving rations, commanding staff, making administrative decisions, supervising economic activities. At the royal level, the Queen Mother, the mother of the ruling king, held a position of genuine institutional authority. The Elamite royal succession system, as we noted, passed laterally among brothers before descending to the next generation. This meant that the same woman could be the mother of multiple successive kings, and that her authority, accumulating across the reigns of multiple sons, could be very substantial indeed. The great queens of Elam are not well known to the general public. Their names do not appear in the standard histories that most people encounter, but in the Elamite record they are present as real actors with real authority. Napir-Asu, the wife of Untash-Napirisha, the king who built Chogha Zanbil, left behind a monument that is one of the most remarkable objects from the ancient world. Her bronze statue, found at Susa and now in the Louvre, is a nearly life-sized figure of a woman in elaborate dress. The statue is cast in an extraordinary technical achievement. The bronze is solid throughout, not hollow, which means the statue weighs approximately 1,750 kilograms, almost 2 tons of bronze cast in the 14th century BCE. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The detail of the clothing, the elaborate fringed robe that was the costume of Elamite royalty, is rendered with precision that speaks of master metalworkers working at the absolute limit of their technical capability. The statue's original head has been lost. It was removed in antiquity, probably by looters who wanted the gold that may have covered it. But the body that remains is one of the most powerful ancient artworks in existence. The inscription on the statue's skirt is a curse, a formal warning that anyone who damages or displaces the statue will be struck by divine punishment. The queen asserting in the permanent medium of bronze and the permanent language of divine threat that her image should endure. It has. 3,400 years later, Napir-Asu stands in the Louvre, still waiting for her head, still impressive in her weight and her detail and her defiant permanence. The women of the Elamite royal family were not passive. They were educated. They managed large households. They participated in the religious ceremonies that were central to the kingdom's legitimacy. They sometimes governed in the absence of male rulers, and in at least one documented case, a woman appears to have exercised something very close to independent royal authority. The Elamite administrative texts from Susa include documents in which women give orders, receive reports, and make decisions about the management of significant resources: agricultural output, craft production, personnel. These are not women performing domestic tasks. These are women functioning as administrators. In the context of the ancient Near East, in which the administrative systems of Mesopotamia were overwhelmingly male in their personnel and their assumptions, the degree to which Elamite women participated in formal administrative life is remarkable. Why was Elam different? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. The specific cultural values and social conventions that produced Elam's relatively greater space for female authority are not directly documented in the way that the authority itself is documented, but the pattern is consistent enough across enough evidence to be real. Elam gave its women, at least its royal and elite women, more formal authority and more recognized institutional roles than most contemporary civilizations. The visual art of Elam is one of the least appreciated artistic traditions of the ancient world. This is not because it is minor, it is because it is not well known. Because the Elamite objects that survive, scattered across the Louvre and the National Museum of Iran and various other collections, are rarely presented as a coherent artistic tradition, rarely discussed in the terms that would allow a general audience to understand their significance. They deserve better. The bronze work of Elam is extraordinary. The statue of Napir Asu, a nearly 2 tons of solid bronze, is the most spectacular example. But the Elamite bronze tradition produced many other remarkable objects: figurines of deities and worshippers, ritual vessels, weapons, tools, and the great bronze supports and accessories of temple furnishing. The technical achievement of Elamite bronze casting, the ability to produce objects of this size and this quality with this precision of detail, places the Elamite metalworkers among the most skilled in the ancient world. The stone sculpture of Elam has a distinctive visual quality that is immediately recognizable once you have seen it. The figures are solid, rounded, with a specific treatment of surface that gives them a sense of contained power. The faces have a particular serenity, not the rigid frontality of Egyptian sculpture or the more expressive style of later Greek work, but a specific quality of calm authority that is characteristic of the Elamite tradition. The rock reliefs of the Middle Elamite period, carved on natural rock faces at sites in the Zagros Mountains, show Elamite kings and gods in monumental scale, the carving deep and confident, the compositions conveying the specific visual language of Elamite royal ideology. The relief at Kurangun, carved in a cliff face above a river in what is now Fars province, shows a seated divine figure, possibly the great god Napirisha, receiving worship from smaller human figures. The carving technique is assured, the scale dramatic, the rock face itself incorporated into the composition as a natural architectural setting for the divine scene. The pottery of Elam, across its various periods, shows consistent mastery of the ceramic medium. The early Susa painted pottery, already mentioned, is among the finest of the ancient world. But the Middle and Neo-Elamite periods also produced distinctive ceramic traditions, particular vessel forms, particular surface treatments, particular decorative conventions that mark Elamite pottery as immediately recognizable. The stamp seals and cylinder seals of Elam are a world in miniature, tiny carved objects whose imagery encompasses the full range of Elamite religious and cultural life. Animals in combat, divine figures with specific attributes, sacred trees and cosmic symbols. The specific Elamite conventions for representing the divine and the royal world compressed into objects small enough to be held in the palm. These seals are not merely beautiful, they are documents. Each image tells us something about what the Elamites believed was important, what they thought the divine world looked like, what symbols carried power and meaning in their specific cultural context. And the reading of these images, the slow, patient work of iconographic analysis, is one of the ways in which scholars have been able to reconstruct aspects of Elamite religious and cultural life that the partially deciphered texts alone could not provide. The Elamites spoke to us through their art when their written records fell silent, and their art, when carefully listened to, is eloquent. We return now to where we began, the year 1187 BCE. The army of Shutruk Nahhunte, king of Anshan and Susa, marching west across the plain of Mesopotamia. Shutruk Nahhunte was the greatest of the Middle Elamite kings, the ruler who brought Elamite power to its maximum expression, who led campaigns across the ancient Near East that none of his predecessors had equaled, who returned to Susa with a collection of trophy objects that made his capital the greatest repository of ancient loot in the world. The campaigns of Shutruk Nahhunte were not random raids. They were systematic, deliberate, and extraordinarily successful. He attacked Babylon, then under the rule of the Kassite dynasty, the foreign kings who had ruled Babylonia for centuries. The Kassite Empire was weakening, its internal politics troubled, its military power reduced from its earlier height. Shutruk Nahhunte saw his moment. He took the city. More importantly, he took what the city contained. The stele of Hammurabi, the great black basalt pillar inscribed with the law code of the most famous Babylonian king, the monument that represented the legal and moral achievement of Mesopotamian civilization, was carried to Susa. The statue of Marduk, of the divine king of the Babylonian pantheon, whose presence in his temple was understood as the literal guarantee of Babylon's divine favor, was carried to Susa. Dozens of other trophy objects, statues of earlier kings, religious monuments, objects of gold and silver and precious stone, were carried to Susa. And the victory stele of Naram-Sin, the great Akkadian king who had himself boasted of conquering the world centuries earlier, was carried to Susa with a new inscription added by Shutruk Nahhunte, recording that he was now taking this trophy from the already conquered conqueror. The archaeology of Susa bears witness to this extraordinary moment. When French archaeologists excavated the Acropolis of Susa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, they found, in a single layer of deposits, the accumulated loot of Shutruk Nahhunte's campaigns. The stele of Hammurabi, the victory stele of Naram-Sin. Other Mesopotamian monuments carried to Elam as trophies. These objects had been in Susa for nearly 3,000 years before the archaeologists found them. They had been brought there from Babylon in the 12th century BCE and had simply remained, while the city around them changed dynasties and languages and religions until the modern excavators uncovered them. The discovery was one of the most dramatic moments in the history of Near Eastern archaeology. Objects that scholars knew from ancient textual references but had never expected to see physically had survived, preserved by the dry climate of Khuzestan, waiting to be found. The theft of Marduk was more than a military trophy. In the ancient Near Eastern worldview, the statue of a god was not merely a representation, it was, in a specific theological sense, the god's actual presence in the human world. The statue housed the divine, was the medium through which the divine was accessible to human worship and petition. When Marduk's statue was removed from his temple, Marduk was gone. The divine favor that Marduk's presence guaranteed, the fertility, the prosperity, the military success, the cosmic order, was withdrawn from Babylon. The ancient texts of Babylon describe this in terms of profound theological crisis. Lamentations were composed about the absence of Marduk. Theological explanations were developed for why the god had allowed himself to be taken, why he had chosen to leave Babylon, What sins of the Babylonians had made him willing to depart? The power of Shutruk Nahhunte's victory was not merely military, it was cosmic. In the specific cosmological framework of the ancient Near East, he had captured not just a city, but a god. Elam, at this moment, was the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world. It would not remain so, but for a generation, the statue of Marduk stood in Susa. And the king of Elam was the man who had taken the supreme god of Babylonia and installed him in his own capital. The Middle Elamite period of glory was followed by centuries of turbulence, political instability, Assyrian pressure, internal conflict, that eventually led to what scholars call the Neo-Elamite period, roughly the 9th through 7th centuries BCE. The Neo-Elamite period was not a period of decline in all respects. Elamite culture remained sophisticated. Elamite art continued to develop in distinctive directions. The cities of Elam continued to be inhabited and to function. But the geopolitical context had changed dramatically. The Assyrian Empire, the military state centered in northern Mesopotamia that would eventually conquer most of the ancient Near East, was growing in power throughout the 9th and 8th centuries BCE. Assyrian military campaigns extended their reach progressively southward and eastward, bringing them into direct contact with Elam. The relationship between Elam and Assyria in the Neo-Elamite period was defined by conflict, a long, episodic, mutually destructive struggle that went on for more than a century and that ultimately ended in Elam's destruction. The Elamites were not passive in this struggle. They were active, determined, and sometimes successful. They allied with Babylon against Assyria, the former enemies finding common cause in the face of a shared threat. They supported Babylonian rebellions against Assyrian control, providing troops and resources to the Babylonian resistance. The Elamite-Babylonian alliance against Assyria produced some of the most dramatic military history of the ancient Near East. Battles that shook the foundations of the great empire, moments when the outcome hung genuinely in the balance. The Battle of Halul, fought approximately 691 BCE, is one of the most extensively described battles of the ancient Near East. The Assyrian king Sennacherib and his army faced a combined Babylonian Elamite force in a clash that both sides described, in their own records, as a great victory. The reality was probably a costly and inconclusive engagement that left both sides significantly weakened, but neither destroyed. The Neo-Elamite art of this period developed in directions that reflect the specific pressures and the specific cultural dynamics of the age. The most distinctive products of Neo-Elamite art are the great bronze vessels and plaques decorated with scenes of royal ceremony and divine worship, objects of extraordinary craftsmanship that show Elamite artists working in a tradition that had evolved significantly from the Middle Elamite period while retaining distinctly Elamite characteristics. The human figures in Neo-Elamite art are more elongated than in earlier periods, the compositions more complex, the range of depicted subjects broader. The influence of Assyrian art, the most dominant artistic tradition of the ancient Near East in the first millennium BCE, is visible but not overwhelming. Elamite artists absorbed elements of the Assyrian visual vocabulary while maintaining their own distinct aesthetic identity. This is the pattern of a sophisticated artistic tradition in contact with a powerful neighbor, adopting what serves its purposes, resisting what does not, maintaining the thread of its own specific character through the influence of the external. The Neo-Elamite artists knew what Elamite art was, and they continued making it. In 646 BCE, approximately 2,670 years ago, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal invaded Elam. This was not the first Assyrian campaign against Elam. There had been multiple earlier attacks, multiple earlier destructions of Elamite cities, multiple earlier Assyrian assertions of control over Elamite territory. But the campaign of 646 BCE was different. It was total. Ashurbanipal was one of the most ruthless military commanders the ancient world produced, and he was determined to end, permanently and completely, the Elamite resistance that had challenged Assyrian power for a century. He was also, paradoxically, one of the most cultured kings of antiquity, the creator of the great library of Nineveh, the man who collected texts from across the ancient Near East and preserved them in a systematic library that would be discovered by 19th century archaeologists and proved to be one of the most important archaeological finds in history. Ruthless and cultured, it is a combination that history has produced more than once. The Assyrian annals describe the campaign against Elam in explicit and brutal detail. The destruction of Susa is described with a thoroughness that makes clear Ashurbanipal intended it to be definitive. The temples were destroyed, the palaces were razed, the royal tombs were opened, and the bones of the ancient kings were removed and taken to Assyria, where they could no longer receive the mortuary offerings that Elamite theology required for the peace of the dead. The ancient texts describe a desolation of Susa that was intended to be permanent. The removal of divine statues, the cutting down of sacred groves, the salting of the fields. The Assyrian account of the sack of Susa is one of the most harrowing passages in ancient Near Eastern literature. It describes the silence that followed the destruction, the absence of the sounds of human life, the stillness of a city that had been continuously inhabited for more than 4,000 years, reduced to rubble. Susa was not permanently destroyed. The city eventually recovered, was rebuilt, and went on to serve as a capital of the Persian Empire within a generation of Ashurbanipal's destruction. The resilience of the city was, as always, extraordinary, but Elam, as a political entity, did not recover. The destruction of 646 BCE ended the Elamite kingdom. The political structures, the royal dynasty, the specific institutional forms of Elamite civilization, these did not survive the Assyrian campaign. The Elamite people continued to exist. Elamite culture continued in modified forms in the communities of Khuzestan and the Zagros mountain valleys. The Elamite language continued to be spoken and, remarkably, continued to be used as an administrative language even under Persian rule, as one of the 3 official languages of the Achaemenid Empire. But Elam, as a kingdom, as a political power, as the entity that had challenged Babylon and Assyria for 1,000 years, that ended in 646 BCE, the long story was over. One of the most remarkable facts about Elamite civilization is what happened to its language after the kingdom ended. The Elamite language is a linguistic isolate, a language that is not demonstrably related to any other known language family. It is not Semitic, like Akkadian or Aramaic. It is not Indo-European, like Persian or Greek. It is not related to Sumerian. It stands alone in the linguistic record of the ancient world, without clear relatives in any direction. This isolation makes Elamite unusually difficult to study, and particularly valuable as evidence because it preserves in its specific grammatical structures and vocabulary the trace of a linguistic community that developed entirely independently of the great language families that otherwise dominate the ancient record. The Elamite language is attested across more than 2,000 years of written records. From the earliest legible Elamite texts of the late 3rd millennium BCE to the administrative documents of the Achaemenid Persian period in the 5th century BCE. And this makes it one of the longest attested ancient languages, a remarkable continuity of linguistic tradition across political transformations of every kind. When Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered the ancient Near East in the 6th century BCE, conquering Babylon in 539 BCE, and establishing the Achaemenid Empire, he made a decision that reflects the practical wisdom of the early Achaemenid rulers. He used Elamite. The Persepolis fortification tablets, a massive archive of clay tablets found at the ancient Persian capital of Persepolis in the 1930s, are written primarily in Elamite, not in Old Persian or in the Akkadian that Mesopotamian administrative tradition would have suggested. Elamite was the administrative language of the heartland of the Persian Empire in its earliest phase. The scribes who kept the records, distributed the rations, tracked the movements of workers and livestock and goods across the vast Persian imperial system. They wrote in the language of the civilization that the Persians had conquered. This is a remarkable testimony to the practical importance of Elamite administrative expertise. The Persians, newly dominant over the ancient Near East, not yet in possession of their own developed administrative tradition, found in the Elamite scribal culture an existing system of record-keeping that worked, and they adopted it. The civilization that Ashurbanipal had destroyed continued, in this specific institutional sense, to shape the civilization that came after it. The Behistun inscription, the great triumphal inscription carved by Darius the Great on a cliff face in the Zagros Mountains, the inscription whose trilingual parallel texts in Old Persian, Elamite and Babylonian Akkadian made possible the decipherment of cuneiform writing in the 19th century, is written in Elamite as one of its three versions. Without Elamite, the Behistun inscription would be a bilingual rather than a trilingual text. And the specific contribution of the Elamite version to the process of decipherment, the way in which the three parallel texts mutually illuminated each other, was crucial to the success of the decipherment effort. The Elamite language, surviving into the Persian period as an administrative tongue, contributed directly to modern scholarship's ability to read the cuneiform scripts of the entire ancient Near East. The Forgotten Empire left in its linguistic legacy a key that unlocked the written records of ancient Mesopotamia. The relationship between Elam and the Persian Empire that succeeded it is one of the most important and least discussed dynamics in ancient history. Persia, the civilization of Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, the Achaemenid Empire that stretched from Egypt to India and that shaped the entire subsequent history of the Near East and beyond, was not born in a vacuum. It was born in the specific landscape and cultural context of the ancient Iranian world. And that world had been shaped profoundly and fundamentally by Elam, the Persian heartland, the Fars province of modern Iran, the region around Persepolis and Pasargadae, the specific geography where the earliest Persian states developed, is essentially the same region as the ancient Elamite highland territory of Anshan. The mountains and valleys where the Elamite Sukals of Anshan had ruled for centuries were the same mountains and valleys where the early Persian kings established themselves. The continuity is physical. It is written in the landscape itself. But it goes beyond geography. The administrative system of the early Persian Empire, the use of Elamite scribes, the use of the Elamite language, the specific bureaucratic conventions of the Persepolis archives, represents a direct institutional inheritance from Elam. The artistic traditions of the Achaemenid Persian court, the specific ways in which Persian royal art depicted kings and gods and ritual ceremony, show significant Elamite influence. The griffin, the winged lion, the specific conventions for representing divine figures. These elements of Persian visual culture have Elamite antecedents. The religious traditions of early Persia and before Zoroastrianism became the dominant religious tradition show elements that may reflect Elamite religious influence. The specific divine figures, the specific ritual practices, the specific sacred animals of the early Persian record have parallels in the Elamite religious world. And Susa itself, the ancient Elamite capital, became one of the principal capitals of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Darius the Great built a magnificent palace at Susa, decorated with glazed brick reliefs of extraordinary beauty. Xerxes added to the Susa complex. The city that had served as Elam's center for 3,000 years served as Persia's center for the 2 centuries of Achaemenid rule. The Persian Empire is famous. It appears in the standard narratives of world history, in the accounts of the Persian Wars with Greece, in the story of Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia, in the biblical narratives of Cyrus freeing the Jewish exiles from Babylon. Elam is not famous. It does not appear in most standard histories. Its name is known when it is known at all, primarily to specialists. But the Persian Empire, which is famous, was built on Elamite foundations. The administrative systems, the artistic traditions, the specific geographic and cultural context that made Persia possible were all, in significant measure, Elamite. The forgotten empire gave the remembered empire the tools it needed. The modern rediscovery of Elam began in the 19th century, when European archaeologists first began systematic excavation of the ancient sites of the Near East. The French mission at Susa, which began in 1884 under Marcel Dieulafoy and continued under various directors for more than a century, was the central event in the modern rediscovery of Elamite civilization. The finds from Susa were spectacular, and their removal to the Louvre was the product of a specific colonial arrangement in which the French government was granted exclusive archaeological rights at Susa by the Qajar dynasty of Iran in exchange for diplomatic and financial considerations. The result is that a significant proportion of the most important Elamite objects, including the statue of Napir-Asu and the stele of Hammurabi, are in Paris rather than in Tehran. This colonial archaeological history is a source of genuine tension. Iran has requested the return of certain objects from the Louvre, and the question of repatriation, of who has the right to the physical remains of ancient civilizations, is one that the international archaeological community continues to debate. But the scholarship that the French excavations produced, the publication of the Susa material in extensive detail, the work of generations of scholars on the Elamite texts and the Elamite art, was a genuine contribution to human knowledge. The discovery of Chogha Zanbil, the ziggurat city of Untash-Napirisha, was a major event in 20th century archaeology. The site was excavated by the French archaeologist Roman Gierschmann between 1946 and 1962, and the results were extraordinary. Chogha Zanbil is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the best preserved ancient sites in the Near East, and the most impressive surviving monument of Elamite civilization. Iranian archaeologists have contributed significantly to the modern understanding of Elam, working at sites across Khuzestan and the Zagros mountain region, producing new evidence that supplements and sometimes corrects the picture developed by earlier European excavations. The National Museum of Iran in Tehran houses important Elamite collections, objects that were excavated under Iranian supervision or acquired through Iranian state archaeological programs, presented in a context that frames Elamite civilization as part of the deep Iranian national heritage. This framing matters. The question of how ancient Elam relates to modern Iran, whether the Elamites are Iranian in any meaningful sense, what the relationship is between the ancient civilization of the lowland plains and the modern nation that includes those plains is a question with both scholarly and political dimensions. The scholarly dimension, Elamite civilization, preceded the arrival of Iranian-speaking peoples on the Iranian plateau. The Elamites were not, linguistically or probably ethnically, the ancestors of the Iranian peoples who built the Achaemenid Empire. They were a distinct people with their own language, their own traditions, their own identity. But the political dimension, the territory of ancient Elam, is now part of modern Iran. The sites of Elamite civilization, Susa, Chogha Zanbil, The rock reliefs of the Zagros are within Iranian borders. The heritage of Elam is, in a geographic and political sense, Iranian heritage. The modern study of Elam reflects these complexities, conducted by scholars of many nationalities, funded by different national and international bodies, interpreted through different cultural frameworks. What all interpretations agree on is the significance of the civilization being studied. Elam was not minor, it was not peripheral, it was one of the great civilizations of the ancient world, and its contributions to the history of human culture, in art, in administration, in linguistic tradition, in the specific forms of civilization that it passed on to the Persian Empire, deserve to be much better known than they are. The plain of Khuzestan in southwestern Iran is still there. The same rivers, the Karun, the Karkhe, the Dez, still flow down from the Zagros mountains and spread across the plain in the same seasonal rhythm that sustained the ancient city of Susa for 5,000 years. The summers are still brutal. The same relentless heat that the ancient Elamites endured in their baked brick cities. The winters are still mild. The agricultural potential is still extraordinary. The Tell of Susa still rises above the plain, a mound of accumulated human occupation more than 30 meters high in places, its lower layers reaching back to the 5th millennium BCE. Today, the modern city of Shush surrounds the ancient Tell, and a 19th century French castle, built by the French archaeologists to protect their excavations, sits incongruously on top of the mound, a piece of French colonial architecture placed on top of 5,000 years of Iranian history. Beneath the castle, beneath the French excavation trenches, beneath the medieval Islamic layers and the Sassanid layers and the Parthian layers and the Hellenistic layers and the Achaemenid Persian layers, the Elamite city waits. Most of it has never been excavated. The proportion of Susa that modern archaeology has examined is a small fraction of the total deposit. The deepest and earliest layers, the levels that would tell us most about the origins of Elamite civilization, are largely unexcavated, buried beneath the subsequent millennia of occupation. Susa is still speaking to us. We have heard only a small part of what it has to say. Chogha Zanbil stands alone on the plain 50 kilometers from Susa, in a landscape of remarkable emptiness and remarkable beauty. The ziggurat rises from the flat ground in its distinctive stepped form, its surviving 2 stories of ancient brick, visible from a considerable distance across the plain. The surrounding sacred complex, the walls of the outer city, the foundations of the palaces and temples that filled the space between the ziggurat and the city walls, is partially visible in the landscape, the outlines of ancient buildings preserved in the low brick stubs that emerge from the soil. Standing at the base of the Chogha Zanbil ziggurat and looking up at the ancient brickwork, the same bricks that Untashnapirisha ordered, pressed and fired and laid 3,400 years ago, the experience is one of genuine awe. Not the constructed awe of a famous tourist site with a gift shop and an audio guide. The quieter, more profound awe of standing before something that was made by human beings, that has endured through 3,500 years of heat and rain and earthquake and the ordinary entropy of time, and that is still here. The name of the king who built it is still pressed into every brick. Untashnapirisha. 3,400 years of the sun and the rain, and his name is still there. The statue of Napir-Asu stands in the Louvre, still waiting for her head, still impressive in her weight and her precision and the specific quality of the craftsman's attention that went into making her. The stele of Hammurabi, the law code that Shutruk Nahhunte carried from Babylon to Susa, stands in the Louvre beside her, the legal achievement of one ancient civilization preserved by the military triumph of another. The proto-Elamite tablets sit in museum cases and archive boxes across the world. In Paris, in Tehran, in London, in Chicago, still unread, still containing whatever they were written to say, still waiting for the scholar who will finally find the key to their language, the ancient Elamite language, the linguistic isolate that has no known relatives, survives in the texts that the patient work of 19th and 20th century scholars has partially deciphered. The Elamite texts that can be read tell us something. The Elamite texts that cannot yet be read, the proto-Elamite tablets, hold something more. And somewhere in the unexcavated depths of the Susa tell, in the layers that no archaeologist has yet reached, the full story of the ancient city waits. In the bricks that Napir-Asu's architects laid, in the tablets that the scribes of Untashnapirisha pressed, in the offerings that the priests of Inshushinak placed in the sacred darkness of the temple. The Elamites were not gods, they were not superhuman, they were people. People with names and families, and specific skills and specific fears and specific hopes. People who got up in the morning and worked and ate and argued and fell in love and grew old. They built something that lasted 3,000 years. They gave the world a language that helped unlock the entire written tradition of the ancient Near East. They gave the Persian Empire the administrative tools it needed to govern half the known world. They stole the god of Babylon, and the world forgot them. The forgetting is not the end of the story, it never is. The forgetting is simply the silence between the last speaking and the first new listening. We are listening now. Rest now. The plain of Khuzestan is breathing. The same wind that moved through the streets of ancient Susa. The same rivers flowing down from the Zagros mountains. The same stars above the ziggurat of Chogha Zanbil. The name of the king still pressed into the bricks. Still there. After 3,400 years, still there. Good night.